Welcome everybody to the PEF once again. Welcome back for those who've been before. And if you're first timers, just a quick kind of summary of who we are. So we're the Palestine Exploration Fund. We've been around since 1865, but we haven't been here since for that long, I promise. Anyway, and we were founded to conduct research in the Levant on everything material, as it were. So the archaeology, ancient history, flora and fauna, etc., etc. Couple of notices. Fire exits, there's one there, and there's one where you came in, and we assemble outside Waitrose because that seems very civilized, but that's not going to happen. Okay, so on to tonight's speaker and on to tonight's talk. And the subject of Nik's talk got me thinking a little bit about one of the nicest days that I have ever spent, not in Jordan or on the Hijaz railway, but actually at Palmyra. And at Palmyra, me and the group of people we were with, we had a really fabulous afternoon kind of discovering and exploring the ruins, not the fancy stuff that everybody goes to see, but the stuff that's kind of built in amongst and around. So the Byzantine and Islamic houses that are kind of accumulate after the heyday, supposed heyday of the site has been and gone. Because that's the point, isn't it? That sites don't just kind of start and stop. They have lives and they have an extension, which perhaps isn't the way in which most people get to know about a place. But it was a lot of fun, and there we were kind of trying to work out, you know, the phasing of this particular building, and oh look, they've borrowed a stone from over here and they've squished it into this bit. And it was a lot of fun. And maybe I'm strange, maybe my idea of fun isn't everybody's idea, but I suspect, given that we've got so many people here tonight, that actually it probably is. And I'm really glad that Nik has come to talk to us about his Spolia Fest in Jordan tonight. And to give you a little bit of heads up on Nik, he is an archaeologist and Islamic archaeology PhD candidate at the University of Bonn. And he's excavated sites in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and focusing on the Ottoman Empire, so really quite recent stuff as well, and particularly the material cultural record of the imperial indigenous interactions in the empire's Arab provinces. He has written on the archaeological legacy of the Hajj Road, as well as the methodology of excavating modern archaeology in the context of 20th century military and industrial installations. And so over to you, Nik.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for listening. So I am a PhD candidate at Bonn and an archaeologist. Thank you so much. Today we're talking about the material afterlives of the Hijaz railways. That's the Ottoman railway in the post-Ottoman landscape. So my main focus for my research is the Ottoman Empire, and I try to look at the ways that the imperial, which is the Ottoman Empire, interacts with indigenous actors in what is now modern-day kingdoms of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But what we're discussing today actually comes at the very end of my area of expertise and bleeds into an even more modern period, because we're looking at the landscape after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. Just because the empire ceases to exist does not mean that the railway vanishes. And what we're looking at is how this piece of material culture, once so representative of the Ottoman Empire, continues to inform the dynamic between an imperial centralizing force and a decentralized nomadic population. So that is the British Mandate on one side and the Bedouin on the other. So and it works. That's fantastic. We're off to a great start. So I actually do work a lot with the material culture of the Hijaz Railway in my research. Normally my focus is on it in its context with the Ottoman Empire. And when I am problematizing the railway to try and understand its use history, I break it down to these sort of four different categories, different phases. These are not the same length, and they often overlap with each other. It's just four different ways to sort of conceptualize what the railway was. So to start with, the construction period, which is 1900 to 1908, when they're building the Hijaz Railway all the way from Damascus down to Medina, replacing that leg of the Syrian Hajj Road and making the Hajj caravan of camels, mules, and horses no longer the major way that pilgrims are performing the holiest journey in Islam. So that's 1900 to 1908 that it is being built, but as soon as they start laying down track, it goes into use. Ottoman officials are traveling up and down the line, German engineers as well, and also the Ottoman army, who immediately start using the sections of railway that have been laid to control local populations in the Transjordan and the Hijaz, and even using it to get down to Yemen as well. But from 1908 till 1916, it is used by pilgrims as well, who are performing the Hajj. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca declares the Great Arab Revolt, and at that point it stops being used by pilgrims, but continues being used extensively by the Ottoman army because it becomes their primary sort of strategic artery connecting the garrisons in Damascus with Medina. And because it is so important to the Ottoman presence in the Arab provinces during the war, we start to see it getting destroyed between 1917 to 1918. And that's a very short period compared to these other slightly longer periods of use. It's only 2 years, but it's the most famous, especially for us here in Western Europe and Britain, because of the exploits of the infamous or famous T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. But it's not just him, of course. He's working alongside Sharifian regulars and Bedouin regulars to sabotage the railway. Here's one of Lawrence's photos blowing up the railway near Daraa. That's now in modern-day Syria. And at first in 1917, it's an act of sabotage to keep the Ottomans occupied in the rear. So they're constantly trying to rebuild the railway, and they're expending resources, men and material, fixing the railway who could otherwise be used fighting Allenby in the Palestine. But then in 1918, when Allenby advances on Jerusalem, the Arab forces in the rear advance on Damascus, and they begin a wholesale destruction of the line from the Hijaz all the way up towards Damascus. In 1918, the destruction period ends, the Ottoman Empire ends, and we get to the period that I'm going to be focusing on today, which is this period of redefinition, which starts in 1918 and really continues through till today. But my primary focus for the talk today is going to be 1918 till the 1940s-ish. So just some photos here. This is from the PEF collection, a lovely picture of a Hijaz railway carriage, just to give you an idea of what it looks like when it's in use. But what we're discussing today is what the Hijaz railway looks like when it looks like this. This is a length of Hijaz railway iron that has been installed as a supporting beam into the roof of an otherwise totally traditionally built Arab house. And this is this phenomenon of spoliation, which is going to be the focus today. This, especially in modern-day southern Jordan and across modern-day Saudi Arabia, you see this proliferation in spoliation and recycling of Hijaz railway and using it to build houses. And within this phenomenon, we see something of the archaeology of the colonized, as Michael Given would call it. Because, again, this is my research, is how empires and indigenous populations interact and influence one another. And what I'm going to propose today is that you can actually observe the interaction between a centralizing imperial state and nomadic tribes, and you can see the impact of policies of one group upon the other, upon the lifeways of the Bedouin. And you can also see Arab Bedouin resilience and agency in the face of imperial policies through this material afterlife of the railway and this case of spoliation within Arab houses. When I say central state here, this is no longer the Ottoman Empire. This is now the British Mandate. Though it is a mandated territory, the British Empire took care of Transjordan's foreign affairs and its military. Only domestic affairs were in Arab hands. So it is a form of continued imperialism, though it is different in certain ways to the Ottomans. So I'll just address this quickly with these two photos here. This is a photo of the railway being destroyed by the Imperial Camel Corps, who were fighting alongside Sharifian regulars as they pushed up towards Damascus, blowing up railway stations, ripping up lengths of railway iron and looting carriages. And this photo is from the 1930s, and it's of the Desert Patrol. And so the Desert Patrol was a Bedouin police force that was raised by Glub Pasha, a British officer working within the Arab Legion, which was the sort of nascent military of the Emirate of Transjordan. He had learned the lesson from the Ottomans that the best way to control the Bedouin was not with foreign troops, because that led to the Arab Revolt, but it was by giving the Bedouin the means to police themselves. And that's what the Desert Patrol was. It was a Bedouin police force, which remains in effect in Jordan to this day, and they're highly decorated and respected members of the Jordanian military, but it also gives you an idea of what this mandate-era imperialism looked like, because yes, the Bedouin are given the tools to control and police themselves, but it was on the behalf of the Emir and Amman and his British colleagues, which is not how the Bedouin had historically lived. So what we're exploring is the transformation of Bedouin economy and ideology with the British Mandate in southern Transjordan following the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And to do that, I have made extensive use of the archives here at the PEF. So a little bit of promo you're going to see today about the PEF archives themselves. And I'm going to give us all a case study to sort of explore this act of spoliation of the railway and what does that actually tell us about the interaction between imperial and indigenous actors. So we're going to look at the region around Schulbach Castle, transliterated in various ways. It's also known as Montreal. It used to be a Crusader keep, then it was an Ayyubid castle, then it was a Mamluk soap factory, then it became an Ottoman village built within the ruins of this castle. And so the photographic archives here at the PEF correspond with what I've already found in Ottoman tax registers, oral historical claims from people from the region who have spoken to, as well as the reports and travel accounts of various explorers, some of whom were members of the PEF. All of it kind of proves that this southern Transjordanian landscape, and the Hijaz too by extension, was dominated by nomadic tribes, which is the opposite of what you kind of see, or the impression you get when you visit the regions of Schulbach today. Because in the valley below Schulbach Castle, where this is a photo from Hornstein, we're going to see it, a clearer version in a moment, at that time we're seeing just Bedouin black tents in the landscape. And today you have lots of these, they call them the abandoned villages. They are traditionally built Arab houses, built using traditional resources. They're built in a style that has been done since the days of the Mamluk Sultanate. So they look to be very old. These are hamlets, about 30 farmsteads each, and they're scarcely occupied today. Most of these houses remain owned by various families, but they will now live in modern cities in the region. These houses are abandoned or they're rented out to small farming groups. Some are still occupied by Bedouin. But these abandoned villages, though they look like they're as old as Schulbach Castle itself, I argue are only as young as the railway itself, and the construction of these villages was concomitant with the spoliation of the Hejaz Railway, and it was all a part of the forced sedentarization, forced sedentary living that the British Mandate placed upon Bedouin in southern Transjordan. So we can see, we can see in the architectural record of traditionally built Arab homes, the incorporation of railway irons, and I argue this tells us something about how the British Mandate changed Bedouin lives. And that's the précis for everything we're discussing today, so you can stop listening now. But now I'm going to give you all the data to back up those points. So what I'm discussing, this act of recycling, is called spoliation. Archaeologists love to talk about spoliation. It's a favorite topic of ours. And it is the act of when one socio-cultural group takes the material culture of a previous group and incorporates it into the creation of their own material culture. As you often see this with architectural things as well. So all of the motivations for why one would spoliate exist along the spoliation scale. And at the one end you have symbolic reasons to spoliate, and at the other end you have pragmatic reasons to spoliate. And people love to talk about the symbolic side of things because it tells a better story. And I've just got some photos here that illustrate the symbolic kind of spoliation. So that would be mosques made out of churches in Al-Andalus, or Byzantine churches made into mosques in Anatolia, which is where these are as well, but also in pagan temples that are converted into Christian churches in Rome, which is what these photos are of here. And there are different arguments people raise for why one would spoliate. And when you're looking at the symbolic side of things, the argument is usually either one of triumphalism or respect for the past. You could argue that by taking one culture's material culture and saying it's ours now, we're changing what it looks like and we're changing its use. It's a way of defeating a former ideology or culture and establishing your own culture in the landscape. But at the other end, you can also argue that it is a form of sort of respect and continuity. It's especially true in the case of Rome. A lot of pagan Romans were becoming Christian, and the idea that pagan monuments were incorporated into Christian religious sites has been theorized to sort of serve as this continuity of modern Christians saying, well, we are inheritors of pagan Rome. So, you know, it's not always about conquest, sometimes it's about making people feel comfortable. At the pragmatic end of the scale is pure quotidian necessity. Why would you take all this time and effort to quarry ashlar to build your house when there is a defeated or no longer extant socio-culture's architecture right there? You just take their ashlar and build it into your own thing. So it's cheaper and more effective maybe to spoliate someone else's material culture. And what I think is very interesting about the Hejaz Railway is for something as secular as a railway line, I would argue it exists in a very spiritual and symbolic landscape, as well as a very pragmatic one too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the perceptions of the railway, both when the Ottoman Empire lived alongside of it, that's 1900 to 1918, and also its afterlife, which is the focus of today's talk, 1918 into the 1940s. We're on to today, but I sort of stop in the 40s for what we're discussing today. So in the eyes of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, the railway was touted as sacralized modernity. For Sultan Abdul Hamid II, it was this wonderful marriage between Islamic traditionalism, which made his world empire unique, as well as what he perceived as European modernity, which he perceived as being necessary for his empire to remain competitive with the great powers in Europe. So it was this perfect marriage of these things. That's how the Ottomans presented the railway. In the eyes of the great powers, especially France and Britain, it was a strategic threat, because now the Ottoman army could get from Damascus to Medina without having to travel down here around the Sinai and down through the Suez Canal. So that meant that they could avoid British and French areas of influence and do all their military movements within their own territory. And that also was a strategic threat, of course, for the Transjordanian tribes. Historically, when the tribes of the Transjordan were engaged in conflict against the Ottoman army, the tribes held the strategic initiative, because in a desert landscape, the most mobile force holds the advantage. And historically, the Ottoman army was a large field army with goods trains, wagons, and artillery. The Bedouin fought on horseback, and they fought through raiding. But with the advent of the railway, the Ottomans could now get their troops to anywhere along the length of the line very, very rapidly, so now they had the initiative. And this was also seen in the eyes of the Hijazi tribes too. They were also aware of the strategic and economic threat the railway posed. It meant that pilgrims no longer needed to rely on Bedouin to ferry them safely to Medina. But also there was this element of it being a blasphemous innovation, especially as you get closer to the religious centers at Medina and Mecca. One argument was that any form of performing the Hajj that used technology that had not existed at the time of the Prophet was in and of itself blasphemy, but also there was a deeper sort of Islamic literary argument made against why the railway should even exist in the first place. We'll get to that in about 2 slides. But now I'll just talk quickly about, from 1918 through till today, the railway is seen in 2 very different ways, both very secular and also very spiritual. When I've spoken with Jordanians and asked them why is it that the act of spoliation, this wholesale act of ripping up the railway irons, ripping up railway sleepers and incorporating them into the construction of otherwise traditionally built Arab homes, why do you see that mainly around southern Jordan and then extensively as you go into the Hijaz? Up here in the north, from Damascus to Amman, even coming down towards Katrana, the railway is still very much in situ. You can still see whole lengths of it in the landscape surrounded by the old railway stations. As you come down to southern Jordan, lengths of it start to go missing. And as you come down into the Hijaz, there is no trace of it left in the landscape. You might get a raised railway siding, tracing the side of a modern highway, but there's no in situ railway iron left anymore. So the spoliation gets worse as you go south. And when I've asked my colleagues, why is this? One of the arguments they make is that the railway was seen as diagnostic of the defeated Ottoman Empire. And they say, well, the south is where the Bedouin lived, and the Bedouin hated the Ottoman Empire more than the sedentary cultivating fellahin who lived up here in the north. So it was an act of triumphal indigeneity, ripping up the railway line and redefining it as Arab material culture by installing it into their houses. But when I've spoken to the people who to this day live within these houses or whose ancestors built these houses, they often point to it just being a raw material that was just very, very useful. It was cheap and it was there. And for a rapidly sedentary indigenous population, that mattered more. So you see that the railway exists all along that spoliation spectrum. I'm going to be talking more about the pragmatic today, but let's just talk a little bit more about the spiritual character of the railway. I do find that just rather interesting. Most railways are not religious endowments, but the Hijaz railway was. Not only were they building railway stations, such as Daraa here, this photo is in 1901, they also built mosques along the length of the line as well. It's a photo from 1906. And the Sultan even commissioned a mosque wagon to be built that could be transported along the length of the line, complete with a minaret and a mihrab. Although I don't think it ever left the siding in Damascus, this gives you an idea of how, in Sultan Abdul Hamid's eyes, this was a continuation of that time-honored religious traditionalism that was the Hajj road. The Hajj caravans were always a spiritual endeavor mixed with an element of the secular. My research focuses a lot on Hajj forts, which predate the railway stations. And these were fortifications where pilgrims could sleep safely during the night, safe from Bedouin raids. They also had access to water within these fortresses. There was usually a small garrison. But as much as they were strategic, these fortresses all had a small mihrab that faced the Qibla, and even some of them had minarets as well. So they were both religious and strategic. The railway was a continuation of that, and that's how Sultan Abdul Hamid wanted it to be seen. He wanted the local population to focus more on the fact that this was a gift to Islam from him, more than the fact that it meant he could get his troops anywhere in the Arab provinces as quickly as he liked. But now we get into a conversation of blasphemy. So this is a great little example. This was taken when I was lucky enough to visit an in-situ length of the line just south of Amman, and my colleagues in Jordan, who I'm very grateful for, translated this for me. And so it says, "From the charity of our Lord, the Commander of the Faithful, the Ghazi Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan II, may Allah bless him and help him." Now, lengths of railway irons always have the European or North American manufacturer's mark on the side of them, but sometimes they'll have this dedication written as well, which was written by the Sultan, for the Sultan, really, but it was just a way for him to remind people who traveled on his holy railroad that they were performing a pilgrimage thanks to his beneficence, thanks to his generosity as the Caliph of Islam. This was his gift to the Muslim world. But in that lay an element of blasphemy in and of itself, and this was part of the reason why around Hijaz, Medina, and Mecca, it was so staunchly resisted. And this is a quote from the Quran, which effectively reiterates a very common line of literary thought in the early days of Islam. Islam, when it first started, was a religion that had a largely nomadic or semi-nomadic following. And the question that early Islamic scholars would ask is, how would our religion hope to survive in this world when we're surrounded by the ruins of far more established sedentary empires like the Egyptians, the Nabateans, and the Romans, who all grew so powerful through being sedentary as opposed to nomadic, but all met with destruction? And the answer to that question lay in the question itself, and Islamic scholars would argue that it is through living humbly, living nomadically, living with the means that is given to you by God, that is how you truly prove your worthiness. And by building monuments that would imply that you are greater than people, closer to God, that in and of itself is a blasphemy. And that is how, around the Hijaz, the railway was increasingly perceived. The Sultan made it very clear that this was his great generous gift to the people of Islam, and that was seen as overstepping and breaking that covenant with God. And so all these arguments formed the Railway War. I won't talk too much about the Great Arab Revolt because most of the people in this room, I am sure, are familiar with that, but also because there are people who can talk about it more knowledgeably than I. But I just want to show these photos that kind of show how my work overlaps with the Arab Revolt. This is from the Rhodes collection here at the PEF. This is in New Zealand.
That's right.
He's New Zealand. There we are, my home country. Here we have a good Kiwi cavalry officer speaking to Sharifian regulars and Bedouin irregulars. Down here, this is from the Imperial War Museum. These are a group of it's an Ottoman railway battalion returning to Damascus after a day repairing sabotaged lengths of the line. And this photo is great. This comes from a German archive. The Germans in 1918 took a lot of photos of Hijaz railway stations, doing their Ottoman allies a bit of a favor. This railway station I've been to, it's Juffa Darwish in central southern Jordan. It's kind of surrounded by a small town today, and these trench networks, which you see here, are no longer evident in the landscape. At least I didn't see them, but I thought it was just really nice to see it like this, because the Germans photographed all the Transjordanian stations. The further south you go, the more of these Western Front style trench networks you're going to see in the aerial photography. The Germans were, of course, lending their best trench builders from the Western Front to help the Ottomans defend their railway, because the railway was becoming central to the war in the Ottoman rear. Now here we are at Zizia Station. This is a little bit south of Amman, and I just wanted to include this photo just because it shows you what a railway station on the Hijaz Railway looked like when the Ottoman Empire was still around. But this is before, it was taken on the same day as the photo at Jaffa Darwish, but they haven't thought to defend these more northerly stations, presumably hoping that the Bedouin will never get so far north. just a nice photo that shows you what a railway station on the Hijaz Railway looks like. The locomotive taking on water, water tower, station buildings, Ottoman campsite up here of the Ottoman army. This is a construction era camp, so the remains of a tented campsite they built when building the railway line. And of course nearby is a Hajj fort as well, because railway stations are often built very close to the Hajj forts that preceded them. And about 14 kilometers south of this station, and over 100 years later, I began my professional entanglement with the spoliated post-war Hijaz Railway when I got to visit Daba station with some Jordanian colleagues of mine, one of whom is a professional photographer, Bashar Tabar, and he took this lovely photo, better than any of the photos that I have taken for my PhD. We've got Hajj Fort off in the distance here as well. We get to see ourselves a railway station that would have once had the name of the station. You can just faintly see it there. And here is the railway line, and immediately to the left and behind where Bashar stood to take this photo is what I was interested in. These are my photos, they're not quite as good. And this is an Ottoman outhouse attached to the railway. You can actually see the Ottomans themselves have been reusing or recycling railway iron to build supports for this annex out the back and also to hold up their ceiling. So this starts to introduce us to the concept of railway iron, the Hijaz Railway itself, being used for alternative purposes. It's likely, though, that the Ottomans recycled the railway iron as they were building the railway itself. So it's not an example of post-war spoliation, it's more just an example of the Ottomans being cognizant of the fact that to build a roof or a ceiling or a floor, even in the Levant, you normally need wood. And wood is a very rare and very precious resource, which we're going to talk about that a lot in a moment. So they simply sealed their ceilings over with railway islands. And actually, the Hajj fort that you just saw off in the distance there, in that corner tower there's an entire floor made of interlocking pieces of railway iron because the Ottomans occupied this fortress during the construction of the railway. So the Ottomans were already doing this. That's not what I want to talk about. So we're going to go south, down the old Hijaz Railway, which is the modern day desert highway in Jordan here, down to the turnoff at where modern day Unaiza is found. You can actually see more trench networks here. We've now gone deep into southern Transjordan. This here is what we want to talk about, the branch line that leads into the Hishi region and onto Shorbak Castle. So that is a road today, but in 1918 this was a branch line of the Hijaz Railway, and a really under-recorded and under-reported piece of the Hijaz Railway that has no trace left in the landscape anymore. There's not a single length of railway iron in situ from this junction through to the terminus of the branch line. But in 1918, it was a fully functioning bit of the railway, and it even came to a small railway station here, Al Nile Station, which also functioned as a lumber mill, because the area around Shorbak has a microclimate, a Mediterranean microclimate, which means the valleys below the castle were able to support scrub oaks, pistachio trees, and cypresses. And you still see a bit of that today, but it was a lot lusher. There were more trees, at least, in the Ottoman period, and the whole region was a little bit more subtropical in the Crusader period. But even in the Ottoman period, although the region was slightly more arid than it historically had been, there was enough wood in this region for the Ottomans to want to build a branch line specifically to cut down the trees, because this whole region is otherwise quite arid and wood is expensive. So the Ottomans tried to make this work. It didn't work very well. The war started not long afterwards. They stopped chopping down the trees. And this is another photo from Lawrence's collection. It's actually taken the day that he and the Sharifian army rampaged their way through Al Nile Station. There's a length of railway iron that's been ripped up, mined, and cast down the side of the siding there. There's a dead horse in the foreground. So this is immediately in the aftermath of that battle. And not long after that, this is what I posit, you start seeing these hamlets begin to appear in the valley below Shorbak Castle. So this is the hamlet, the village of Abu Maktub. It's largely abandoned today, but not truly abandoned. And I was lucky enough to meet with a man who allowed me to take photographs inside of his house. These photos all come from inside his house or the surrounding farm buildings he has built. This is not his house. This is a little bit up the valley from where he lived, but it's built in the exact same style. And I want you to sort of maybe commit to memory, I'm not going to test you later, but just commit to memory what that architecture looks like. And if you imagine that that railway iron was replaced with a large wooden beam, this would be and forget that there's a light bulb there, this would otherwise be a perfectly traditionally built house, built in the Transjordanian highland style that is endemic to the area around Shorbak. You have one large wooden beam in the middle, smaller branches spanning to that beam, then you have a matting of gassab cane laid over the top, You have this sort of black tar-like substance put to the underside to keep out the insects, and then the roof is sealed with earth and beaten down dung. And Abu Maktub is not the only village in the region, but I just want to talk about this man's house just for a moment longer, because he told me that his grandfather, we had a conversation, he took me around his orchard, and it was lovely, and he told me that his grandfather had worked as a signal operator on the branch line. So he had worked on the branch line into the Hishi region prior to the Arab revolt. And then of course one day the Sharifian army come through and they tore up all the railway iron, and the next day he came home and said, well, now we're going to build a house and use railway iron to hold up our ceilings. And what I think is important to my thesis is that my source explained that prior to his grandfather doing this act of spoliation, the family lived in tents. And that is an oral history you encounter time and time again, though this is now Al-Jaya, immediately below the glacis fortifications of Shorbak Castle. Another example of one of these abandoned villages that look to be as old as the castle itself, and elements of it certainly are. Al-Jaya has evidence of an Ayyubid presence immediately following the defeat of the Crusader kingdoms, but a lot of these houses, built in what I would say is a Mamluk Ottoman kind of style, are actually very, very young. More houses, again, incorporating, this house here is the same here, incorporating railway iron to hold up the ceilings. And a lot of these people, a lot of the people who took me around this village and allowed me to visit these houses, had historically lived as Bedouin, and some of them even live as Bedouin today too. So the use life of these villages, I think, was no more than about 20 to 30 years, right after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and before half the population moved into the modern cement-built cities like modern-day Shorbak town, and others returned to Bedouin living in the landscape. And now we turn to the historical record, which is provided by the PEF. So thank you for listening, and thank you everybody for enabling me to access these photographs on multiple occasions. This is another photo from the heirs, what's the same one I talked about before, the heirs collection. You can see here the seal of Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan II, just a perfect diagnostic photo of the Hijaz railway carriages, which were built in Belgium. But I want to talk more about what Shorbak looked like at the same time. This photo is from about 1909, and these from the 1890s, and they show Shorbak Castle living in an isolated, desertified landscape. This is taken from where Al-Jaya stands today, but the hamlet is not in evidence. What you do see is farm plots laid out, potentially farmed by the inhabitants of Shorbak Castle, or farmed by the Bedouin themselves who are living in black tents in the valley. This was a landscape that, in the historical record as well, the Fellahin sedentary communities lived only within the walls of the castle. The landscape was nomadic beyond. This is a great photo, and a very important photo because it shows what Ottoman-era dwellings within Shorbak Castle looked like. This actually ties into the spoliation you were describing, Felicity, because they have just taken all those blocks left over by the Crusaders, the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, and they've built these new houses, which I would argue look very similar to the houses you today see in the valley in Abu Maktub and Al-Jaya. These houses are no longer visible anymore, though. It's the unfortunate thing about Ottoman archaeology is that Ottoman-era archaeology is not really considered archaeology by many people, and so often when you're on an archaeological project in the Levant, Ottoman layers are treated as modern rubbish that you have to remove to get to the real archaeology. And in order to get to the Ayyubid and Crusader layers, this village that existed up until the 1950s within Shorbak Castle was taken away, which is very unfortunate. I've actually got a good friend who lives in Shorbak whose grandfather was the last Ottoman governor of Shorbak, as well as becoming the first Emirati governor. So obviously, despite the regime change in Amman, he was popular enough to get the job twice. And the historical documents state that he and his family ruled the region from within the walls of Shorbak Castle. That doesn't mean they lived within the old Mamluk citadel or anything like that. They lived within these houses here. In fact, my colleague's grandfather or great-grandfather may be present in the photograph there itself. The landscape beyond the castle looked more like this. I've worked in the region before. These are familiar hillsides, which is a strange thing to say. But today you see modern-built cement houses and more of these abandoned villages that look as old as a castle, but I argue are not. But in the early 1900s, this was all Bedouin dwelling, all people living within black tents. And this ties into what you see in both the records of travelers who went through the region, European travelers, as well as Ottoman tax registers as well, from the 1500s through into the early 1900s, southern Transjordan, the area from Karak down to Shorbak and what later includes Man, has a very limited settled population. The majority of the people living in southern Transjordan are nomads. They live like this. So the houses we're looking at, I would argue, have to be built during the period of the British Mandate. I'll talk quickly now about why would you live as a Bedouin? Why would you live nomadically? And one very simple answer is that in a region that has limited resource or can suffer shocks to crops and other forms of agriculture, you want to live a mobile kind of life. A mobile way of living is the best way to survive both social and environmental change. And in a very arid landscape such as southern Transjordan and going into the Hijaz, that is why nomadic living really took hold and was such a successful way of existence. This photo is of the Hijaz Railway as well, down towards Wadi Rum. I have to say in full academic integrity that this is a modern part of the Hijaz Railway. It was built in the 70s to transport phosphate to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is why it has wooden sleepers as opposed to metal sleepers. It's just a slight detail that matters to no one, but I just want to make it clear that though this looks very picturesque, this is not the Ottoman Hijaz Railway, but it is a functioning modern part of the railway. This photo over here is of, I believe, I think I've been able to work this out, a White Hut circumcision ceremony. This is also from the PEF archives. I've tried to do some sort of reverse engineering of certain names of sheikhs that are listed and written down on the back of this photograph. A White Hut circumcision ceremony. They were the paramount tribe in southern Transjordan. They controlled the region around Shorbak. It was a letter from Auda Abu Tai, famous from his association with Lawrence, who actually got my friend's grandfather the job as governor of Shorbak. And this just gives you an idea of the ideal way of living in this landscape and what the landscape itself looked like. This is an arid environment. And in such an, of course, Shorbak has this microclimate, which means that it has slightly more trees than the surrounding region, which is why the Ottomans saw it as so valuable. But on the whole, this is an arid climate which has limited access to specifically wood. So the majority of historical settlement in Transjordan and the Hejaz is in this mountain range that, I mean, it's actually very long. You can argue it goes from the Horan up in the north all the way down through Jordan into the Hejaz and arguably all the way to Yemen. But in Transjordan, it is never more than 40 to 60 kilometers wide. It is a narrow and very, as one goes southwards, increasingly arid belt of land. And in the words of Amar Kamash, who is an excellent Jordanian architect, the environment in Jordan was the architect. You didn't build houses and structures of unlimited fancy. Your construction was limited to what you could find normally within a day's walk of where you wanted to build a house if you were a sedentary cultivating tribe or family. If you look at Man, which is about 40 minutes drive today from Shorbak, the traditional houses are all built out of mud brick because sand was the principal resource there. If you look at the traditional villages around Shorbak, they're all made out of stone. But regardless of this resource, roofs, ceilings, and floors had to be built with wood. There was no way around it. You needed large beams of wood, and in this landscape, beams of wood were not particularly forthcoming. And because of that, wood scarcity made it very valuable. It would cost a lot of money for cultivating households to usually import wood from other regions, sometimes outside of the Transjordan itself, in order to build their ceilings. I've heard a story that down in Alula, in the Hejaz, the ceilings actually utilized mangrove wood, which was being imported from the Arabian Gulf, so being taken across the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula to be installed into the roofs of houses in Al-Ula. Now that's just a folk story. I can't quantify that with any data, but it gives you an idea of how rare wood was if you wanted to build a house. This photo, I think, is just a really nice illustration of that. This is the abandoned village of Shmeka, not far from modern-day Shorbak. It looks down into the Petra Valley, just over here. You've actually got some tents off in the distance, even there. It looks like it's in a completely ruined state. Very few people live there anymore, and you never really get roofs. But there's no sign that these roofs collapsed or burnt down or fell into these otherwise cavernous spaces. And that's because roofs are so valuable that when families would pack up and leave one location for whatever reason and move to build a village elsewhere, they took their roofs with them. They would leave the stones standing because you'll always find more stones where you're going. But a roof was too expensive to leave behind. And actually this photo here, it's hard to see because it's behind my text, and I can't confirm this is what I think it is, which is why it's not pride of place in the slideshow. But it's a photograph by the Imperial Camel Corps. It shows camels being laden with beams of wood and sheets of cane matting. I think it shows a roof on the move. Roofs travelled with the families, they did not get left behind. And so now we have to flash forwards into the post-Ottoman landscape, that of the British Mandate, where we understand that the British were continuing policies that the Ottomans had started in the 1860s of controlling the Bedouin population. The Ottomans had been successful in northern Transjordan by either pushing out the Bedouin or forcing them to live increasingly agriculturalist and settled lifestyles. It was easier to control a population, take censuses of a population, tax them based off an economy that was tied to one location, of a farming economy. It was easier to do that with a settled population than with a nomadic one. And this policy of pressure to settle continues into the British Mandate period, as we were discussing earlier regarding the Desert Patrol, a different form of imperialism, but still a policy of forcing the Bedouin to change the way they live. Under this post-Ottoman pressure to settle, I argue that nomadic populations made a very pragmatic choice when they started building their first ever homes. They could build houses like this relatively cheaply, just with local stones, and they could copy the architecture that you could see inside Ottoman-era houses, such as within Shorbak Castle. The one thing that could potentially break the back of the Bedouin economy would be building a roof. So they made a pragmatic choice, and they spoliated great lengths of the Hijaz Railway. That's 1,320 kilometers of unattended, and because the Ottomans weren't there anymore, unclaimed railway iron with which you could build a house very cheaply. So I'd argue that within this, you can observe this imperial-indigenous interaction. You see how the Bedouin economy, which was not prepared to spend exorbitant amounts of money importing wood, was able to preserve their economy from the shock of the lifeway transformation that was being forced upon them, and they exhibited their agency in the face of externally enforced change. Now we're wrapping up now, which is perfect, we're well on time. We're wrapping up this coherent ramble with a little discussion of the Transjordan Transformed. And these photos come from Glub Pasha's book as well. And he's very proud when he puts these photos side by side. He's talking about his beloved Desert Patrol, describing how in 1935 they were a camel-riding paramilitary, but by 1945 they're driving around in armoured cars. And I think it's a nice sort of visual reminder of what the priorities were in the time of the British Mandate. It was this idea of bringing European modernity to the Bedouin for their benefit. It was seen to be a good thing. I'm not going to get into a discussion of that, but more just observe that undeniably Bedouin lifeways were transformed in southern Transjordan by this energetic British Empire based in Amman. Energetic, oh my goodness, I just had a blank. Energetic British Empire in Amman. And I'd just like to point out that this isn't a lecture to say that the way of Bedouin living was lost forever. I read this a lot, the life way was about to transform irrevocably and things like this. The Bedouin is still very much prominent in Jordan, same too in Saudi Arabia, but in Jordan especially, the Bedouin tribes can be found in the modern day military, in government, in tech, in business, in medicine, education. The Bedouin have a very prominent position in society. But many of them, this is no longer an economic nomadism. This is now a cultural heritage tying them to historically Bedouin tribes. Some Bedouin will elect to maybe in the summer take their black tents into the desert and live in the desert for a few days or a couple of weeks, and some families, some clans still live pastoral lives, herding their flocks and living nomadically, but it is something they choose to do now rather than an economic necessity of living in an arid landscape. So even though being Bedouin is still very much a part of modern day Jordan, it is a different form, I would argue, of being Bedouin to what it was in the early 20th century. And now we get to the final slide before I get to my acknowledgements. These are just photos that I have taken or colleagues of mine have sent to me taken from as far north as central Jordan all the way down into the Hijaz. These photos come from my work I have done in Al-Ula. You just see time and time again traditionally built Arab houses, different styles. You see mud brick here in Al-Ula, you see stone here in Shorbak and Wadi Musa, but always the roofs are replaced with railway iron. And just in conclusion, I do like to hope that by being so versatile and by being able to spoliate this bit of railway iron, this bit of Ottoman material culture, the Bedouin were able to survive that dramatic change to their economy being forced upon them in the post-Ottoman landscape. So whether the railway was perceived more as a spiritual form of Ottoman identity that had to be destroyed, or simply just a useful bit of metal that was there, I think it's a bit of both. But I like to hope that through doing this, an economy could be preserved, and a lifeway and an identity could persevere through into the modern world. And these are my acknowledgements. Of course, the PEF is there, Bonn, the Islamic Archaeology Department, and many other people I'm very grateful for. And that brings us to 41 minutes, so right on time, and I think no questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I was looking at those pictures you had of the houses without the roofs.
Ah, yes, we can do that.
Yeah, and it made me think. This is a transhuman lifestyle. This is people who are here for a bit, and then they pack up their roofs and go away. Seasonally.
Yes.
So perhaps it's kind of like semi-sedentary.
Exactly.
Kind of
Even the most settled, cultivating populations in southern Transjordan were still living a semi-settled lifestyle. They moved between houses, and also, it takes a lot of time and effort to rip a roof up and move on. So normally it was if a water source dried up or regional instability made living here with a built-up town like Schmeka, it wouldn't be abandoned every season and the roofs moved. It would be abandoned if living here became increasingly unviable for a sedentary population. And you sort of see this fluctuation between increasing nomadism or increasing sedentary living from the Mamluk period all the way through into the 20th century.
I wonder if you ever see tents being used as roofs.
Oh, like a tent built within...
Yeah. So you have your or you have your structure.
Yes.
And then somebody says, "Oh, we've got a tent. We can stick that over the top and make a roof."
In ruined Karab that you observe up towards Abu Maktoum and Al Jaya, we're going to go back here. In these kind of areas, you do get tents kind of built in among the rubble and the ruins of these houses, because a lot of Bedouin have just come back in again, and they're reoccupying this, which is what Bedouin did historically too. They would reoccupy and live among... I'm going the wrong direction. They would reoccupy and live among otherwise built-up areas. You can see that there are walls here. This is obviously being cultivated and maintained, but there's a sort of tent built within one of these walls. So it was a common thing to be done even then.
Any questions? Go on then, go on, Jeffrey.
Following on from what Felicity said,
Yeah.
have you been able to reach any conclusion at all, if indeed it's been a problem for you, as to whether the whole business of being Bedouin, which is the word we use for Arabs, who Arab Muslim culture that move from place to place,
Yes.
but it's all over the world.
Oh yes, across Africa.
Is it something, in your opinion, which is so deep in the blood that it's genetic?
I wouldn't say so. No.
So
no, it's done entirely out of pragmatism. If humans have this weird ability to live anywhere on Earth, which makes us very strange creatures, but we can live in the desert. But if you're living in the desert, you need to live more mobile. And in times when there has been more moisture in this landscape, you see a decrease. You see this actually. Professor Kennedy, Hugh Kennedy, I think his name is, gave a great presentation on this at Bonn, talking about the Levant, Mesopotamia, and around the time of the Abbasid Caliphate. You see less Bedouin living at a time when the Tigris and Euphrates are really in flux and the whole region is very cultivatable.
So in your opinion then, given the chance through wealth and modern conditions to totally sedentarize, these people will do so and abandon their...
I don't know. I think being nomadic is so culturally ingrained. I wouldn't say it's in the blood from a genetic standpoint, but culturally there's a huge deal of pride, especially you see this in Jordan, where the Bedouin are so prominent, a huge deal of pride in having lived like this. This idea of having lived simply within the landscape, because that kind of ties into that early foundational understanding of Islam as being a religion that was at first very much practiced by semi-nomads and nomads, this idea of living simply, not being so degraded as to live within one place and rely upon a globalized economy and have the time to indulge in trade. Bedouin often would buy, it's very hard to say what Bedouin material culture is, for example, because they would buy so much of the material culture from settled people because they themselves looked down, this historically speaking, looked down upon the idea of having to make anything for yourself. You used your wealth that came from camel rearing and bought what you needed. So it was almost a knightly class. A lot of early European explorers described the Bedouin as sort of a population of knights errant. They travel around, they see themselves as a class above the fellahin, which is why fellahin is often treated as pejorative today. I use it in my research as the alternative to Bedouin. Bedouin is to be in this landscape and nomadic. Fellahin is to be a cultivator, because it means cultivator. But it is often treated as a pejorative term today because that's how the Bedouin used it when to describe people who lived sedentarily. Because throughout this entire period, you had Arab tribes and cultures that lived in settled structures, such as Shorbak here. But in this landscape where things were hotter and drier and life was less reliable, more people were nomadic. And I believe the culture, this was done out of necessity, but then a culture came to inform this as being the better way to do it. I mean, if you look at modern day Bedouin, most of them own lovely houses and live very sedentarily, but still will elect to do some things nomadically when they have time off and things like this. So they do kind of, but it's a cultural sort of resonance now.
Any other questions?
Did the old forts
Yes.
actually define the positions of some of the halts on the...
Yes,
on the
so...
map? I mean, you've shown them a
Yeah.
few kilometres away.
Oh, exactly. No, there's this. So you talk about the old Hajj forts.
Yeah.
They were, because the Hajj road predates the Ottoman era Hajj forts. Hajj forts are built by the Ottomans. They start immediately after the conquest of the region from the Mamluk Sultanate. But the Hajj has been performed since the dawn of Islam, and it predates that as a trade network that Nabateans were using. But there were very well allotted places in the landscape where you would pause, because that's often where water sources were. And I think Hugh Kennedy and Andrew Peterson have written an entire piece about how the existence of Hajj forts was a way for the Ottomans to control water, another way that they could control the nomads in the landscape. The Ottomans had a very limited presence in the south, but if you could build your Hajj forts on top of a natural water source, a spring or a well, or close to a river, it was a way that they could control the Bedouin without having to send their troops too far into the desert and away from the fortresses. So the fortresses do define, but they come afterwards. They define the Hajj road, because the road itself is not a paved way, it is just ruts in the earth by camels.
We went close to that.
And the railway traces the Hajj road almost perfectly. It only deviates as you come down of what Doughty called the brow of Syria. It's that plateau that takes you down from the Transjordanian Badia and down into the Arabian desert. On this plateau, this escarpment, the Ottomans kind of went a little bit eastwards, whereas the old Hajj road wound down a little bit to the west. But beyond that deviation, it very closely follows the historical Hajj road. The clear idea that this is a continuation of that religious practice is very evident in the architecture.
Oh yes, Jack.
Half a comment. You talked about the Jordanian states' pride in their Bedouin past. It's central to their tourism industry to actually spend a night in a Bedouin visit.
Yes.
And it looked exactly like the village, the old photograph you have. You have tents, two rows of tents. And
Yes.
there are dozens of these all over Jordan now, aren't there?
Especially if you're going down to
That's right.
Wadi Rum, that is the Bedouin.
The Bedouin barbecues.
Yes.
That's right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Which I've done many times. Really, really good fun. Historically, this was more.
Absolutely authentic.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I
It
mean,
looks just like
it is authentic in as much as the businessmen who run these businesses in Wadi Rum are themselves
That's
Bedouin.
right, yeah.
I'm friends with a group from the Weld Ali, which was a Bedouin tribe more up in the north towards Syria, but they had a branch down there in Wadi Rum, and you've got a White Hut family there too who have been there since time immemorial, and they run these businesses. So yes, it's being done for profit, but it absolutely is a nice way to kind of preserve and celebrate that. You don't see this so much in the north anymore. There are much more houses in the north now. Yeah, but in the south you still get a lot of this.
2 questions. One at the back first, then you, Jane.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on the prospects of the railway actually being resurrected, if not from Damascus, maybe from Amman, given one of the purposes was the Hajj?
It is really interesting. I know from my colleagues in the region, the big problem now would be crossing from Jordan, or from Syria into Jordan, Jordan into Saudi Arabia. There have been talks about this on and off for years between the different antiquities departments of these different countries, so saying, wouldn't it be great if you could travel the entire Hajj road by locomotive again? And in Jordan, especially on this modern track here, they have one of the Swiss locomotives from the Ottoman period and a few restored wagons, and tourists can ride up and down this length, but though they don't know it, this is from the 70s, it's slightly more modern, but I know it and it drives me crazy. But I will say that there has been a lot of talk about trying to span that entire length again with a railway. One of the problems is it's so extensively spoliated in southern Jordan and in the Hijaz, it's borderline non-existent, that you would have to expend a huge amount of money getting more railway iron and railway sleepers. And the Ottomans, the Sultan pulled from all sorts of pockets to get enough money to fund this. It was a gargantuan financial undertaking. So I think you'd have to rebuild so much of the railway that, and then of course there's the politics of making it span 3 different modern countries. That makes people less keen to do it. But it has been talked about, because I think every country recognizes that that would be great tourism. I mean, not only for pilgrims performing the Hajj, but for foreigners too, who are drawn in by the allure of how we know it in the West. So yeah, absolutely.
Jane.
You were saying that the Hijaz tribes called the railway blasphemous. But don't you think they might have slapped the word blasphemy onto it simply because they were losing an awful lot of income?
Yes, so that is absolutely a part of it too. The accusation of it being blasphemy was certainly thrown around, and then you look at how the Hijazi tribe suffered, and it was because they lost the income of escorting the railway too. So I think, especially theologians in Mecca and Medina, being sedentary themselves, I think genuinely stood by the claim that this was, I'm just trying to go back to my map right at the start. There we are. So I think down here, with you've got these larger settlements, there was more of an actual feeling that this was blasphemy, because they're living within the religious heartland and they're sedentary themselves. For a lot of the tribes that kind of echoed that idea, it's because their economy was losing out. An interesting thing is that Medina was never meant to be the terminus, it was meant to go to Mecca, ideally all the way down to Yemen as well. But the Beni Harb, which is a tribe that live in this region here, staunchly blocked the entire thing. They would not let it happen. And in the end, the Germans and the Ottomans said, "Oh, we'll get back to this later. You know, let's win the war first, and then we'll go back to building the railway." And of course, that never happens. And the Beni Harb definitely made an argument of blasphemy, and it may be more because it was convenient to say blasphemy, when in actual fact it was economic loss that was being suffered by the Bedouin. Yeah.
Well, thanks ever so much, Nick. That was really fascinating. All sorts of questions, I think, over drinks. Thank you.
Right, yes.